Hi, I'm Paige. I'm an alcoholic.
Hello.
Hey, Paige.
And in all honesty, I'm in one of those moods where I'd rather sit and listen, but that's not what today's about, I guess. And I haven't had time to even think about this share until last night. It's been a very busy week, and I guess my life today is very different than anything I would have ever kind of aimed for myself before recovery came in. And my life today it's quite beautiful because I've been able to achieve a lot of things I thought I was incapable of. And just to name a few, I've started a career. I live alone. I have functional relationships with my family and myself and my higher power. I'm in a long-term relationship. I have good friends, and I'm happy. And none of those things were attainable for me when I first came into recovery. And so I grew up in Joburg. I was there for 17 years of my life. My parents got divorced when I was quite young, and all of my behavior kind of started showing around that time. My behavior was very present long before I ever picked up, and I was always just really incapable of self-soothing, being a whole human. I guess I was always a bit of an emotional mess of everything, and I guess that kind of manipulative and attention-seeking behavior came up very early on in my life because I realized that if I behaved that way, I could get the things I wanted, which was normally attention or things from people, and that filled some kind of void in me. I picked up for the first time when I was about 12, but it only really started to really become quite a present everyday thing in my life around the age of 14. And I had moved schools to a much more liberal, free school, and I had a lot of time on my hands, and I experimented with a lot more than just alcohol, which is all I had really ventured into before that time. And at that time, I also ended up on prescription medication, which I very quickly began abusing and manipulating my doctor for either more or stronger of what I was on so that I could abuse it. And I never really took it according to the packaging. I'd share it with my friends so that I would have an excuse and a justification to be getting high at school at the age of 14, 15. And around that time, a lot of my behavior around men and people kind of really escalated. And all of that created a lot of consequences very fast. And by the time I had finished my grade 11 year, or almost finished my grade 11 year, the consequences had piled up to such a point that it was very uncomfortable to stay in the place I had stayed. And my relationship with my mother at the time was very strained. My main mother figure in my life growing up was my older sister, and my father and my stepmother had moved down to KZN, and they'd also had my baby sister through that whole process of my active starting. And I was incredibly disconnected from all of them, really. I kind of just did my own thing, and they didn't really know who I was. And my mom was working quite a lot. She had a very full-time career that often spilled over into outside of work hours, and that also allowed me to have a lot of freedom to do what I wanted, and I didn't really make the right choices with that either. And those consequences by that time had piled up, and a long weekend came where I had been drug tested for the second time at school, come up positive again for the second time at school, and also my behavior. I was on the edge of getting into trouble quite often, and I always managed to manipulate my way out of that. And my mother had to go away for business, and because of all the concerns my parents had, my dad flew me down to KZN for the long weekend, which turned into me being suspended from school as well. And that's where the conversation around me moving to KZN came up. And that whole decision was made with a lot of love, and they were trying to protect me and look after me. But with that move came a very drastic escalation in my drug and alcohol abuse and my prescription medication. I came into a brand new school in Matric. My dad came and basically tried to clean up my mess again, and I tried to start fresh. I stopped using. I didn't really drink initially. I quit smoking for a couple of weeks as well. And by the time my matric dance came, I had started smoking again, started drinking again, picked up again, and I was abusing my medication again. And that was within a couple months of being in the new school in the new town. And in that matric year, my parents were drug testing me. So I leaned more towards what they thought was socially acceptable. And I was incredibly good at pretending I was okay when I wasn't. I drank straight through matric pretty much, and I was on a lot of prescription medication, and they don't mix very well at all. And I managed to somehow come first in my grade in matric while being drunk through finals. And my main motivator was based in resentment to someone I didn't like because of my own faulty behaviors through matric. And that's just really the story of my life up until recovery. Everything I achieved was based on really faulty motives, to get back at people, to get people's approval, to get people's attention. Everything I did was because of that. I never really achieved anything in school because I wanted it. I couldn't really have cared about it. And I took a gap year. After that, my parents encouraged me to. I'd burnt myself out incredibly from my behavior more than anything. And in that gap year, I joined the hospitality industry. And that, I guess, is any addict or alcoholic's paradise. Because you can get away with it. You can take shots as tips. You can get high before your shift, and no one will really notice. And if they do, they don't really care either. And most of the friends that I had made in that time were as into drinking and using as I was. And my life for about a year and a half was go to work in the evening, make money, spend 2/3 or more of that money on drugs and alcohol, pass out, wherever that was, whether that be at home, at a friend's house, at a guy's house, wake up very late in the day, and then repeat. And I did that on loop for a year and a half. And I guess my parents kind of figured out that I wasn't doing anything productive. I was also being incredibly dishonest about the amount of money I was making. I was supposed to be contributing towards rent, which was agreed upon as 50% of what I earned. And I would say I only earned whatever I had left after all my drinking each night. So I didn't really contribute in any sense. I missed a lot of my little sister's life growing up because I was never really present. And within that space, I also was very rarely ever home because I ended up living with whoever I was seeing at the time. I didn't want to be at home. I wanted to be around people that would accept my behavior, my drinking, my using, and my parents definitely didn't. But they also didn't realize how bad it was because I hid a lot of it from them. I started studying while I was still working. I did a 6-month makeup course, mainly because it was suggested by my stepmother, and I just kind of wanted to keep them happy enough to keep off my back so I could carry on doing what I wanted to. And at that point, I also started working at a bar. And a lot of my rock bottom stems from this period of time, but it was a very drawn out long rock bottom. And I studied, but my routine was to go down to college, get high before college, go to college, get high in the middle of college, go back to class, leave, drop someone off, get high, go to work, make sure I get high or drunk while I'm at work, and then leave and wake up and go to college and repeat that cycle again. Everything kind of became about fitting my life around my drinking or using. When I had to go see my parents, I'd make sure I would use, but not too much that they'd know, but just enough that I could put up with having to speak to them because I didn't really want to be around them, if I was honest. They knew who I really was, and that terrified me. And when I finished studying, I carried on working at this bar, and I had been involved with the crowd of regulars there, and anyone that's regular at a bar is typically not the most healthy person. And I spent a lot of time in amongst that friend group, and I created a lot of drama and hurt a lot of people, and I manipulated a lot of people and kind of played them off against each other to ultimately get what I wanted. And what I wanted was to get high and be left alone, but be enabled enough that I didn't have to do anything for myself. And while I was working at this place, I met my last partner in active. And when I began dating this person, it was mentioned by my stepmother that I might be creating some kind of name or label for myself. She was trying to say very kindly that I had gone around the town a bit too much. And so, out of being stubborn and wanting to prove a point, I stayed with this person for a year and a half. I never really cared for them. I ended up moving my dog in at that house, getting a dog with them, trying, I guess, to pretend I had some kind of suburban life. And to all outward appearances, I did. I had my job and I had my dogs and I had my partner, and everything kind of on the surface level looked doable. And behind the scenes, it was quite chaotic. There was a lot of jealousy from his side because I was more interested in spending time with his friends or my friends than him. And I ended up moving to another job just so that that kind of drama would end, because I wanted to prove a point and stay in this relationship. And I built this whole facade based on wanting to prove a point. And I ended up doing a bookkeeping job, but my using escalated into much heavier drugs more frequently, and I got myself into a lot of debt as well, which I'm still paying off drug debt today. And it spiraled very fast, and the relationship got quite toxic and abusive, and I was very alone internally. I was always surrounded by people, but I would withdraw into myself. I was an observer. And I spent time with these people purely because they would accept my behavior, whether that be around my using or just being a really terrible person. They accepted me for who I was, so I stayed. And there were quite a few occasions where my parents would try to tell me, like, you don't have to stay, because they kind of started catching on to the fact that this was a very toxic relationship. It had become physically abusive, and I was too stubborn to admit that anything was actually wrong. And I stayed. And I guess that's my main part in this whole relationship, is that I stayed. And then lockdown came, and I was stuck in a house with someone who I didn't like, let alone care about, and it all really fell apart there. I carried on using. There was a lot of arguments over using. He kind of caught on to the fact that I was the person who had a much more intense using problem out of the two of us, and it was just, if you're trapped in a room with someone you don't like, the cracks are going to start showing, and I couldn't pretend anymore. I had become very aggressive at the time, and I wasn't pleasant to be around, and it was a couple weeks into level 5 lockdown, and I had to leave the property because we couldn't stop arguing, and the landlord basically kicked me out. And I went back to my parents' house for a couple of days, told them that we had had an argument and I just needed some space. And I went back. And within 2 weeks, we had had another intense argument so bad that I ended up being kicked off the property. And my parents came to fetch me. But I really didn't want anyone to really know how bad things were, even though the cracks were blatantly obvious. And I spent a few days at my parents' house trying to pretend I was okay. I was withdrawing a lot, and I very clearly wasn't mentally stable. And every time they asked me to go out to the house to do something, I'd get high and take way longer than it should. To go to the shops and get something would take me like an hour when the shops are 5 minutes down the road. And they sat me down to try confront me, and I can see today it was with a lot of love, but at the time I got angry, and some really horrible things were said to my father by me. And that was kind of the last straw for him. And he had always picked up after me. He had always helped me. He had always bailed me out financially, and I could always go and run back to them. But I had pushed it so far that I got kicked out of that house in the middle of lockdown past curfew, and I packed a bag of the most random crap and I walked. And I attempted to cut everyone out of my life within those 5 minutes and block everyone off. And I kind of had a insane meltdown, which ended up with me in my parents' driveway, where if anyone would come near me, I would scream or cry or get aggressive, and they didn't know what to do. So I ended up in a psych ward with an ambulance taking me there. And again, my dad was the only one who was there. Just before I left was the last time I saw my ex. And yeah, my dad was again the only person who showed up in my state. He was there trying to get me into hospital, which was incredibly hard during lockdown. They had very limited space, and he managed to get me in. And he only wanted me there because he didn't have any other solution. For them, psychiatric medication, psychologists is their solution, and he was trying his best to give me what he knew his solution to be at that time. And that whole stint was interesting. The nurses kind of caught on to the fact that I wasn't mentally ill. I was just a drug addict, but they didn't really say anything. In the institution I was in, their solution is medication. And I signed up for an experimental drug therapy, and I lost a lot of my life memory from that at the time. I've been lucky enough to regain that now. And at the end of it all, I got told I was being discharged, and for some reason I believed I wouldn't be discharged, and that was where I lived. I was completely nuts by that time. I had been in psychosis for a long time. But I was still functional. And when I got told I was being discharged, I called my dad and asked him like what I'm supposed to do. And he kind of just asked me, so what are you going to do? And then said he needs to go. And I kind of realized that I'd cut off every single door, every single person that had ever cared for me, whether that be my older sister, my mother, my stepmother, my father, any of the people that I was involved with and active. No one wanted anything to do with me. And a lot of people from my past believed I had just disappeared or died. And I decided, like, I'm done. And I finally stopped fighting, and I tried to kill myself. And I was almost successful. I'm very grateful that my higher power intervened in that sense, because I didn't succeed. And the next day, my dad fetched me and he told me I was going to a place with people like me who could help me. And that's all the context I got. I ended up in treatment. I didn't know I was in rehab till I finished my admission form, and then the nurse asked me what my drug of choice was. And by that time, I had no place left to go, so I stayed. And I'm really grateful that I had shut off all other options, because if I hadn't had stayed, I don't know where I'd be today. And I started my whole journey in treatment, which was 6 months long. The first 4 months was a lot of fighting, a huge lack of surrender, no compassion, very little thought of others. I was still very stuck in being manipulative, being a very toxic person, and it was still all about me. I did my first set of 12 steps, all the questions, and I was due to leave, and a concerns group happened, and at the time I was very angry about it, but I'm very grateful it happened, because these people cared enough to point out the fact that I wasn't okay. And it was suggested that I stay another month, and that I start an assignment. And at that time, I sat down with two of the counselors. The one was my sponsor at the time, and they sat with me and tried to get me to explain step one. And I sat there for at least half an hour trying to explain or comprehend what step one was 4 months down the line, and I couldn't. And that, I guess, was the main core problem, is that I couldn't accept the fact or even admit the fact that I was powerless, and that I have absolutely no control over everything beyond my actions. I don't even have control over my emotions or my thoughts, but my actions are the only thing that I get to change today. Eventually, my assignment kind of carried on. I did step one 3 times in that assignment, I think, quite a few times. And step 3, I had to do a couple times. I still really struggle with step 3 some days. I can take back my own will very easily. And after the 5th month, another concern group came up, and I was still very much about me, very chaotic, and it was very subtle, but I can't bullshit other addicts, and I'm grateful for that. They knew me and they could see me for me. And I got taken out of concerns for the last month. I got taken out of all the groups except for meetings and step work, and I had to do service to be able to stay. I had exhausted my dad financially, and I needed to be in the kitchen to pay my dues and show that I can be of service and that I can listen to what I'm told to do. And I formed a really special relationships within that role. I learned how to interact with someone as a father figure, I guess, and that was the first kind of healthy interaction I had with someone I viewed as a father figure my whole life, and it taught me a lot about how I interact with my dad today. And I learned to be of service, and I learned that sometimes no matter how much work you put in, you're not really ever going to be acknowledged for it. But internally, I was developing a sense of self-worth for the first time in my recovery. I had an extremely low sense of self-worth my whole life, and I still struggle with that today. But within that service position, I developed some kind of sense of self-worth, and it helped me to actually action my steps and be willing to change things, because I realized that if I work my steps, I can actually start to become the person that I want to be, not just the person that I am as a result of my disease without the steps. And eventually, after those 5 weeks, I was ready to leave, and I started my journey at the halfway house. I still hit my head a lot of times. I was still involved in a lot of concerns groups, and I was on combans, and I made mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes within treatment and the halfway house. And I'm grateful that I did, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been set up with the self-awareness and the tools that I have to apply in my daily life today outside of a safe place, being a treatment facility. And every time I screwed up, I got to know who I was better and how to apply my steps better and how to work my spiritual principles instead of my defects. And I got to discover that I actually have a choice in whether I behave on my defects, which is my default, or my spiritual principles. And it's still a choice today if I choose to behave on a defect and not a spiritual principle, even though I can still behave on my defects. And within the halfway house, there was a lot of growth, a lot of surrender, a lot of humility. I was house leader at one point, and that got taken away because of my own behavior. Again, revolved a lot around my behavior towards people, my codependency, my addictive behavior around people, I guess. And by the time I left, which was 8 months later, I had come to accept that I know my truth, and other people may not completely see my truth, but what they're pointing out still has validity, and it's something that I can try take on and try change, especially if it's people like me. When there's people like me pointing out my behaviors, I can't help but accept the fact that it might be kind of true. And I left the halfway house, and I immediately got into a dishonest relationship. When I say immediately, it was within a week or so. And I think I had been in a lot of denial about the fact that I had those motives, and it caused a lot of pain for me. My sponsor from treatment could no longer sponsor me because there had been a lot of dishonesties around that, and our relationship had kind of broken down, and she also didn't have the experience. And I was referred to Candace, and she helped me a lot through that experience, and she let me learn my lessons and go through the growth instead of trying to stop me from experiencing the pain I did. And I did experience a lot of pain. There was a lot of self-will and no God in that relationship. And I was back to feeling how I did before treatment, based off of one dishonesty that I wanted to follow through with, even though I'd come clean. And that was a lot of growth within itself, and it taught me a lot about how I can behave as a person and how I can really lose sight of my higher power when I make choices based on selfish motives. This wasn't about anyone else but what I wanted again, and it was back to my same behavior. And my friends and my sponsor, they loved me through that. My relationship with my family was still incredibly strained at the time. Um, it had been, my indirect amends have been a very slow process with them, because there is a lot of damage. And by the end of that year, after that very short lived dishonest relationship, I had decided to work on my relationships with people that mattered, my actual amends, which is mainly towards my family. And in a sense, towards the people that I dated before, but through indirectly through other people, if that makes any sense. My direct amends to them is to leave them alone now. But in my relationships with other people today, whether it be friends, family, colleagues, romantic partners, I try and live my amends by not behaving the same way that I did in my active today. And I got to go home that Christmas. I didn't get to go home for my first Christmas in recovery because of the damage I caused. And I got to go home and it was incredibly awkward and very difficult. And my family relationships from there on have grown and developed, because I was given the opportunity to show them that I have worked on myself and that I didn't want to be the same person that had gotten me where I had gone. And I had moved to another house for that brief period of time. Then I went and moved into another house with a bunch of people. And again, my defects got in the way. I did hurt people, and I was incredibly selfish and judgmental at times. And that kind of period at the beginning of this year was very chaotic. And it was a lot of emotional turmoil, and I pushed a lot of my friends away. I started fixing off of work and exercise at one point, and I lost touch with my higher power and why I was doing this. I was filling the void with everything but the steps, the program, and recovery in my higher power. And I reached a very low emotional rock bottom. I was incredibly suicidal at one point earlier this year, and my sponsor really helped me through that. But again, I can still see it was a consequence of my own behavior. And all of that coupled along with like the floods and feeling stagnant, inspired me to change a lot of things about my life. And I manifested a lot of big changes all at once. And I moved to Durban. I got into a relationship. I tried to quit smoking. I was living alone as well, all at once, and it was insane. And I've done this quite a few times in my recovery where I say, okay, cool, I'm going to change, and then I drown myself in growth. And it's painful, and I struggle, but I've always been able to lean on my sponsor and my friends and the people close to me who accept me in my states, whether I'm doing well or whether I'm absolute chaos and seeming quite insane. I've always been loved, even when I couldn't love myself. And within this journey in Durban, I've learned to be okay with being alone, which is something I was never okay with, even in my first year of recovery. And I've come to learn how to have healthy relationships with people and with colleagues, and I've challenged myself, and I've started to enjoy life. Not that I wasn't enjoying it down here, but I'm enjoying it to a different level where I never thought I'd actually live the life I do today. I was quite content just being someone who was enabled and used and didn't achieve much with their life. And today I leave work every single week with a new responsibility. I'm growing and learning how to be in a long-term relationship, and I make some hectic mistakes sometimes, but I learn and I try. And I've been able to develop friendships that are they're so beautiful and organic that I'm still very unfamiliar with the idea of it, but I'm very grateful for it, because I never would have had that opportunity without my recovery. And I also am lucky enough to be able to speak to and see my family regularly. I've been able to go home a few times. Even my extended family is aware of my recovery today, and that's something that my family never really wanted. But the life I live today is not a life where I have to hide. It's nothing that I have to pretend. I don't have to pretend anymore. I can show up exactly as I am and know that I'm still trying, and that's enough for me, because as long as I try to be a little bit better today than I was yesterday, I know I'm on the right track. But yeah, that's been my 2 years. Thanks.
Thanks, mate.